Today I'm going to be explaining how I got 100% on my English coursework and how you can as well. I'm going to be covering absolutely everything you need from researching, planning, choosing your text and writing. Just a disclaimer, I got 100% for the AQA A-Level English Literature A coursework. So this video is really a detailed breakdown about how to get high marks for that exam board. So the best preparation that you can do for your coursework is, unsurprisingly, wider reading. For your coursework, you need to pick 2 literary texts to write about in a very detailed way. And it's very difficult to know what texts you might want to write about if you haven't done some preliminary wider reading. The wider reading helps you to establish what authors, time periods, types of literature like genres you might be interested in. And if you're interested in what you're writing about, it's going to be a lot more enjoyable, and that's going to come through in your writing being more interesting. Choosing your text is where the serious work begins. This choice is one of the most important steps in creating your NEA. But before you start choosing your texts, it's important to know what not to do. I've noticed on the student room that occasionally students aren't alerted by teachers when they choose a prohibited text, so it's really important to know what you can and can't pick. These prohibited texts change as the exam board changes the set text, so you must check them. You can find the prohibited text list in the exam board syllabus on the AQA website. Make sure you have the latest one. There is also a long list of requirements for the texts, so you need to check those as well. Within those requirements, however, some texts are still more challenging than others, and this is where your first decision comes in. AQA has stated that they value fresh and individual responses, and choosing a text that is more uncommon or rarely seen is a good way to ensure that your essay is more unique. After all, they have to wade through tons of essays, many about the most commonly chosen texts, so picking something original will immediately set you apart from the crowd. I therefore recommend picking either a more common text and a rarer text, or 2 less common texts. Rare here doesn't mean you have to go scavenging for some never read out of print author, it just means a text that is more unusual at A-level. For example, for my coursework I chose one really common text, which is Ibsen's A Doll's House, that's done all the time for this coursework, and one more obscure text, which was Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. That is literally really unusual to do for A-level. A good indicator of whether a text is more ambitious and will impress the examiner is if it has no GCSE or A-level guides available, like on Amazon, for example. You type in no A-level or GCSE guides. Okay, now you have an idea about how to start choosing your text, we can think of some other considerations that we can use to narrow down our choices even further. I'm going to be talking about this more later, but as with the rest of the A-level, AQA wants students to take a historicist approach to the coursework, which means you need to consider the historical context of the text. Since you have to pick 2 texts, you have the choice to pick either 2 texts from the same time period or 2 texts from 2 different time periods. So this is where your second major choice comes in. Picking 2 texts from the same time period will necessitate more depth of knowledge about that particular time period, otherwise you will just end up repeating the same context for both texts. Picking texts from different time periods might mean you need to be more careful to pick texts that work together, and that you have to be more perceptive about how to link 2 very different texts. It's clear there is no right or wrong answer to this question, or that there isn't necessarily a superior approach. However, in my personal experience, most of the people I know do the second approach from different time periods, and I think this is actually a better and easier route because it's more challenging to find double the amount of historical context for both texts when they're from the same time period. Once you know what approach you want to take, you can start to decide on your first text. One very important element that is often overlooked in finding the text is considering whether it has accessible critical commentary. Some texts don't have many articles or books on them that are readily available or reasonably priced. It's really important to check before you choose to text whether any critical material is available. For top marks, you want a range of critical articles or a book that you can quote and respond to in your essay. So if the text only has one book on it and it's like £50 on Amazon, you're a bit stuck really. Now you've picked one text and you probably have an idea of some of the themes and ideas in that text that you find interesting. The next step is to pick another text and start thinking about the thematic overlaps between them. It's worth noting here that although AQA gives a list of possible themes, which you can see on screen, they clearly state that they are absolutely fine with themes not on this list. Really, any important abstract concept can be a theme as long as it is important in that text. For example, monstrosity, religious faith, revenge, or representations of childhood. Don't be afraid to go for a unique theme. Just make sure that the theme is relevant to both of your texts. Just to give a quick example, gender is a pretty obvious theme for the bell jar, but the nature of healing is less obvious. As with the text choice, AQA values originality, and since they will read hundreds of essays on the most commonly chosen themes for a text, it really sets you apart to pick something more unique. You could pick a theme that is rarer for that text, like identity in a doll's house rather than gender, but also some themes are just more rare across the board, such as religious faith or monstrosity, making them instantly more striking. As long as they are significant in the text you've chosen, then don't feel you can't go for a more original theme. You're aiming for originality, but also for a theme that you can see explored in both texts. This is a bit more complicated, but AQA states that the thematic links between your texts are most productive when readings of the text are enabled in ways that would not otherwise be possible. What does this actually mean? It basically means that by comparing how both texts portray the theme, you start to see them both in new ways. So going back to the text, you might ask yourself, how are the themes presented differently and how are they similar? You might ask, what characters, symbols, linguistic devices, etc. do the authors use to present these themes and how are they different or similar? Why are they presented differently, or why are they presented the same way in both texts? What is the effect of these similarities and differences? Why did the authors decide to present them in this way? How does that difference or similarity make us reevaluate both texts in the light of each other? In order to be able to explore how the two texts present your theme, differently and similarly, your texts need the right amount of difference and of similarity. I think the best way to ensure this is when two texts are not so similar that they do not have any significant differences, nor so different that they have no overlap of themes. Another way to think about this that I like to use, which can also be used for the unseen prose or poetry exam, is the idea of similarity within difference or difference within similarity. Let me explain what I mean by this. Two texts may appear on the surface in their plot, characters, setting to be very different, leading to many surface level contrasts. For example, Titus Andronicus, a Shakespearean revenge tragedy about an ancient Roman commander, and Morrison's Beloved, a novel about the haunting legacy of slavery set after the American Civil War, would seem to have little in common at first. However, on a deeper level, texts which appear different may have many thematic overlaps. So continuing with the previous example, both Titus Andronicus and Beloved explore the idea that violence has a long-lasting legacy that becomes more than the event itself. Both explore the desire for justice, and both feature racial hatred. For differences in similarity, you want to be doing the same thing but in reverse. Two texts which seem superficially very similar can have interesting thematic differences when further investigated. They may superficially use very similar methods or have a similar setting and genre, but the way they use these methods to explore the theme could be very different. When choosing your texts, you should have this constantly in mind. Your texts should have this sort of interesting overlap between similarities and differences. So, your school, like mine, has picked a text for you and the whole class is learning that text. It's likely that the text your school has picked will be less obscure, so it's a good idea to pick a second text that is more ambitious. The most important thing to remember when the whole of your year is doing the same text is not to all write about the same themes. It may seem obvious, but AQA have said that when schools do this, they often see a whole year of students writing on very similar themes, using the same quotes and the same context, probably because they have all been taught these themes in class. It's important that you therefore take any information from class as simply a baseline for your own research, and always remember that the whole class will be hearing the same quotes, same analysis, same everything. For example, if your whole class, like mine, does a doll's house, then most people will write about women's disempowerment or feminism. When the moderator receives 10 essays all on this topic, it makes them appear unoriginal and does not create a good first impression for top marks. So pick a theme that enables you to do something different with the text your school has picked. For example, instead of talking about feminism or female disempowerment in a doll's house, you could talk about identity, money, or masculinity. By far the most important part of creating your coursework is creating your question. A great question can help you get top marks, a passable question can make it harder to get top marks, and a bad question will cut you off from top marks entirely. But don't worry, because it's actually not that difficult to write a good question. The aim of the coursework is to get you to contribute to a genuine literary debate. So one of the things that we must not do is create a question that does not lead to an interesting debate. For example, the question, in a doll's house and Middlemarch, consider the view that women are restricted in a patriarchal society, does not spur a genuine debate, because this is just a fact. The definition of patriarchy already includes women being restricted, so the question asks you to prove something that is already proven by the terms of the question. The coursework question should not be used as a way to just show that you can spot things about text, but should enable you to engage in a genuine literary debate around those texts. You'll know when you have a genuine debate when there is more than one plausible answer. We could turn this previous question into a better question by asking instead whether Nora and Dorothea are unable to escape the patriarchal control of their societies. We have changed the question from stating a fact to asking a genuine question. This debate now has more than one side, because we can point to different parts of the text to argue either that these women are able to rise above the patriarchal control of their environment, or that they are not, or maybe somewhere in between. Also, do not fall into the trap of trying to be too clever when writing your question, which particularly affects those aiming for the higher grades. This can lead to overly complicated questions that aren't really clear. For example, this hypothetical question. To what extent do Pamela and the bell jar demonstrate Judith Butler's theory of performativity? This is way too complicated and just unnecessary really, since the same point could be made in a way that is actually comprehensible. Also, theories like Butler's performativity are too ambitious, so although you could touch on it in your essay, making it the central idea is way too ambitious. To rework it, we would remove the overly technical term and refocus on what we actually want to say in more simple terms. We could instead ask the question, it has been said that gender is an act that we put on, just as we put on clothing. To what extent is this true in Pamela and in the bell jar? Another mistake is being carried away by the need to see the text through a historicist lens and using the texts as a way to prove a historical fact. The point of context is to illuminate the text, not the other way around. It is still an English essay, so your question must ultimately be about the texts, not history. The question, using the bell jar and a doll's house, to what extent does society oppress women, is clearly more about history than the texts themselves. It's also important not to make the scope of the question too small or too big. Your essay will be around 2,500 words, so it's important the question enables you to come to an answer in that amount of space. For example, the question, explore the significance of the colour green in the bell jar and Othello, is too small, focusing on one narrative aspect. The question, it has been said that Jekyll and Hyde and Frankenstein are key texts in the Gothic genre, compare and contrast the presentation of the protagonists as agents of the Gothic and discuss how these texts contributed to the development of the genre and the 19th century literature as a whole, as you can tell by my difficulty in even saying the question, is obviously too big. Similarly, the question, demonstrate the influence of society on texts X and Y, is also far too big. We want something broad enough that it isn't just seen in one particular element or moment of the text, but not so broad that it asks too many questions we simply don't have time to answer. Now that we've said not to do, what should we actually do? I'm going to break this next bit down into more sections to make it a bit more digestible. The first step is to mind map your two texts, writing out all the possible thematic links between them. Also note if there are any links in context or content, for example a shared symbol, because we can compare the way they use these symbols differently to express their shared theme. Remember to use the difference in similarity or vice versa approach mentioned before to get the most out of comparison. See whether you have enough of a thematic overlap to write a whole essay on. The theme is key because within a theme there may be many different questions. For example, the theme of love could be broached in hundreds of different ways. Tragedy of love, egotism of love, society versus love, for example. Once you know your theme, you can play around with creating different questions to reflect different aspects of the theme. Different questions will result in very different essays, so this is where you really hone in on your specific focus. Using your specific theme and focus, you can move on to actually piecing together the wording of your question. There are a few methods to do this, but I'm going to be going over the quotation method because that's what my school uses, and AQA specifically says that if it's done right, it can work well. Keep in mind, however, that this is more of a guideline than an iron rule, and there are other methods. The quotation method is basically where you have a template for your question, which is built around a quotation. The template is this. It has been said that, insert your quote here. In light of this view, compare and contrast the presentation of insert your theme here in your first text and your second text. To what extent is it true that insert a more specific version of your theme in these two texts? Let's break down what this formula is trying to do. The first sentence uses a quote, which should ideally be a real critical quote from a literary critic, author, philosopher, or significant historical figure. The quote should express an interesting provocation or statement that can be argued for or against, setting up a debate. The use of a critical quote immediately shows that you have read around the theme and helps to show that you are interested in a genuine debate. It is key that this quote makes sense, is not overly complicated, but also that it says something interesting that genuinely spurs questions about the texts. The second line is more practical, as it clearly names your theme and your texts, making it completely clear what the topic is. It also includes the key phrase presentation of, which is really important in showing that you are not considering the characters as real people, but rather are considering how they have been shaped by the author. The third line introduces the idea of to what extent, suggesting that the answer may not be black and white, enabling you to give a more nuanced answer and showing your awareness of this subtlety. It also enables you to give your key theme again, but this time in a more specific way. Let's have a look at my own coursework question and see how it fulfills the aims we just discussed. My question was, it has been said that identity is achieved only through antisocial action. In light of this view, compare and contrast the presentation of the search for identity in Ibsen's A Doll's House and Ellison's Invisible Man. To what extent is it true that non-conformity is presented as the only way for the protagonists to find their true selves in these two texts? First, we have a quote by a literary critic writing about Invisible Man, so we have shown that we are already considering different viewpoints. The quote makes sense, it's not overcomplicated, but it is quite interesting and provocative. Is it really true that rejecting social norms is the only way to find our identity? Only is also a really good word here because it means that if we find any evidence that other factors might be equally or more important than antisocial action in creating identity in these texts, we can discuss the alternatives these texts present and still be responding to the question. The second line does all the practical things it needs to, naming the text and theme. But notice I've also taken the opportunity to make my specific focus even clearer, saying it's the search for identity that I am interested in. The third line clarifies and adds more specificity to the terms that I've introduced. To what extent makes it clear that there is no simple answer to this question? Non-conformity adds a clearer understanding of antisocial action by clarifying what I take the quote to mean, which is that antisocial action is not conforming with society, which will be my focus. Two other words are important: protagonists and true selves. Protagonists establish that I'm going to be discussing the two main characters' identity, which is very important for the novel and play I discuss, because it has many scenes and characters. True selves helps to clarify my understanding of identity, which is that I am interested in the idea of one's true self, their genuine self that has to be discovered, rather than just identity as who we are now or what we do. If you decide to use this template, you have to make use of the quotation in your essay. AQA has said that when this method fails, it's when students don't make any reference to the quotation in their essay, making it look as if it's just in there for the sake of it. You have to constantly be referring back to the quotation in your essay and make sure that you are not drifting away from your focus. There are other methods that you can use to create your question, but the reason I like the quotation method is that it makes it very clear what you are going to discuss, and the quotation gives you a good reference point to keep you on track. To help you keep track of research, I recommend right from the start creating what I call trackers to note down information you find interesting while you're doing your research. You basically make a table to write down any useful critical quotes or context that you read about. Here is an example. Write down anything you think could be useful and where you read it. You can then come back to this table when planning. Write down literally anything you find interesting, even if it doesn't appear superficially related to your theme, because themes often overlap and it will give you a wider understanding of the text. It's important to remember as you are researching that you need to address the assessment objectives in your essay. Some of these objectives will be addressed just by writing a well-structured essay that has effective analysis of the text, but for other assessment objectives you have to be more proactive in researching and including them in your essay. I found that there were 3 things in particular that I had to make more of a conscious effort to consider at the research stage, so I'm going to briefly outline them and how to incorporate them into your research. There are 3 things that are important to know about how AQA wants you to use context in your coursework. Firstly, do not include vague context such as women were oppressed in X era without any specific details. The more specific the context is, the better, and I really do mean specific. If you want to give a brief quote from a contemporary historical or literary figure, go for it. You can still refer to a more general context implicitly. For instance, when writing about a text set during racial segregation in America, your analysis of particular quotes will probably refer back to Black oppression. But to really impress with your use of context, you want some really specific context for each text. This means that while researching, you should particularly look out for any quotes or interesting detailed facts that show specific knowledge. The second thing to remember is that AQA considers context to include the historical context of the text's reception, not just its creation. So you can consider in your essay how the historical context of a critic contributes to their viewpoint. In AQA's own words, the goal is to show how the time when a text is written will have an impact on its ideas, and the time when it is read will influence how it is received. This means that you can use context that relates to how different eras have interpreted the text in different ways, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the critics section. Lastly, when finding interesting context in your research, consider how this context helps you to understand something ambiguous or interesting about the text in a deeper way. If you find that it doesn't help you to analyse something about the text, then it isn't worth mentioning, so just find something else or get rid of it. For your coursework, you need to think about the genre of your texts. But I think first it's important to understand what AQA actually means when they say genre. Genre can actually cover 2 slightly different things. Firstly, it means the major genres or types of literature, which are prose, drama, and poetry. And this is the main sense in which AQA seems to use the term. So considering your coursework texts in this sense of genre would mean thinking about how the type of text you've chosen contribute to their effects. For example, the nature of a play is that the audience cannot see inside the characters' minds. So it's interesting to consider how authors navigate this through different methods, for example, soliloquies in Shakespeare. The second kind of genre is what is often called subgenre, that is, genres within those three major genres I just mentioned. Genre in this sense is more about style and literary conventions, for example, Gothic literature, magical realism, or tragedy. Both genre and subgenre are really useful to think about for your coursework texts, so you should research both. The most important thing though is that you don't write about a play like it's a novel or vice versa. To avoid this, pay attention in your research and analysis to how the unique features of the text's genre help shape their meaning. For example, how an author uses stagecraft or setting if your text is a play. You must use quotes from literary critics in your essay to debate different views on your texts. In your research, pay attention to areas where critics disagree with each other and have a think about what your own opinion on the topic is to weigh up different interpretations of the texts. As with contexts, critical viewpoints should be as specific as possible, e.g., quote what the person said and give their name. Do not speculate about what a hypothetical feminist or Marxist critic would say. There is literally no need to do this, and you can just quote an actual feminist or Marxist critic. AQA does not say there is a set number of critical quotes that are needed, so you're going to have to use your instinct, but I would say it needs to feel like a decent amount. For reference, I used 8 critical quotes in my coursework essay. There is, however, an important exception that you must remember when researching. AQA wants you to refer to critical views across time. This means that the critical views should not all come from the same era, but should span different time periods. For instance, rather than refer to 5 critics' views from the last 10 years, it would be better to refer to 1 opinion from when the text was written, 1 from recent times, and 3 from other periods in between. For example, in my coursework, I mentioned critics from the 19th century, the late 50s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and 2011. AQA gives the example of an essay on King Lear that uses critics from the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. As you can imagine, this needs to be taken into account when you are researching. It is such an important element for the highest marks that AQA even says that simply looking at the dates in the bibliography of the essay is enough to know whether you have fulfilled the idea of text across time. With all of this, it's important to be constantly asking yourself your own opinion about the text, how it compares to any critical viewpoints, and how these critical views fit with your argument. You shouldn't use any critical views for the sake of it, but should use them to build up your argument. I'm going to now give you some good resources that you can use in your research. JSTOR is a really good online database for academic articles on basically any subject you can imagine. Some articles are free, so that's really good, and JSTOR also offers access to up to 100 articles online for free every 30 days, though not all articles are included in this free online account. It is possible your school has access to the whole of JSTOR, but a lot of state schools like mine don't. I kind of hate saying this because it's really unfair and a clear example of educational inequality. But most people who have attended university in the UK have access to JSTOR, the whole of JSTOR, through their alumni account. All you need to do is get them to register as an alumni of the uni they attended, and they should then get access to JSTOR online. It's worth asking yourself if you know anybody who has been to university who would do you a favour and give you access to their JSTOR account. If not, your teachers who will have been to university should get you the articles you need if you ask them. Another resource is university level books on your selected texts. These can be very expensive, but if you use a second-hand website like AbeBooks, you can get them more cheaply, so that's a good option. There are also radio programs like In Our Time that cover many key literary texts or themes, and lectures from various universities can be found on YouTube. If you're doing a Shakespeare text, Emma Smith's Approaching Shakespeare lecture series, available on the Oxford Podcast website, is a great place to start, since she has a lecture on pretty much all of his plays. By analysis, I mean your ideas about the text themselves, the meat of your essay. Organisation is really key here so that you can keep track of all your thoughts on the texts and don't have to scramble around for them later. So read your text a second time, but this time annotate any interesting passages. Create a table for interesting quotations, making sure to note down the page number. You can add any points of analysis you think of. Don't worry about having detailed analysis on every quote because you can add to the table later, or you might just end up not using that quote. By the end of the reread, you will have a document with loads of interesting quotations, giving you lots of choice when you come to decide which to include, and making the process of planning a lot less stressful. It's also a good idea to create a summary for each chapter or scene after you've read it. This is because you will need to know the structure of the plot well, and because you might need to find certain scenes or moments again. It might seem unnecessary, but trust me, if the novel you have picked, if you pick a novel, is more than 300 pages, you will absolutely get lost if you haven't got a summary for it. The summaries don't even have to be particularly detailed, they can just list the key events. I found it useful to put my chapter summaries on a sticky note and stick them inside the novel that I was doing so that I can quickly flick through to find anything that I need later. As you reread the text, get a better understanding of the structure of the text and start analysing any interesting quotations. You should start to be able to get a vague, rough idea of what the answer to your question is going to be for each text. You will naturally start to come to your own opinion about these texts and how they answer your question. As you start to head towards the next stage, planning, decide what you think the answer to your question is for both texts, so you know what the end point of your essay will be. At this stage, it doesn't matter if you are still thinking about the text separately, because if you've done the previous steps correctly and chosen two texts which aren't too similar or too different from each other, then you should already be able to see that they either come to different conclusions on the question or approach the same answer in quite different ways. The planning stage is where we finalise the shape of our argument. By this stage, you should have a rough idea of the end destination of your essay, but all the important points in between may be missing, or you might have too many different ideas and you're not sure which to use. Let's have a think about how we can get closer to a cohesive plan. There are many ways you could go about this, but I'm going to be sharing the method I used and found effective. The first thing you need to decide is how you are going to divide your essay. So on a really basic level, we have an intro, main bit and conclusion. We can leave the conclusion and intro for now and come back when we have decided what we want to say. Instead, we focus on the middle bit first, which gives us the actual content of our essay. Like an exam essay, the main section needs some sort of organisation. In an exam, you would do 3 or 4 paragraphs. So what you can do is mirror this in your coursework and do 3 or 4 sections instead. To clarify, a section is basically a part of the essay with a certain focus. So all of your sections should focus on different parts or aspects of the question while building on each other toward the conclusion. It is also key that both texts are in every section. This means that a section is absolutely not a paragraph, and you must break down each section into multiple paragraphs. If you don't use any paragraphs, you will impair your grade, as it will just be a wall of text. So we know our endpoint and our basic layout. How do we decide what goes in each section? Well, this is where different approaches come in, but I like to use what I will be calling an episodic approach. This basically means that rather than skipping around the text all over the place in our analysis, we pick 1 or 2 episodes in each text to discuss in every section and go into detail. By episode, I mean a plot point or event, such as a particular action scene, the ending, the introduction, etc. These should be in chronological order so that we can see changes in the presentation of the theme across the text. The episodes that you pick massively change the shape of your argument, even if you are going to end up at the same point. This means that we have to think carefully about which episodes to pick. Think about why the scene is important in relation to the whole work, which scenes are turning points that show character development, and remember that the ending is basically always really significant to any text. Once you're happy with your choice of episodes, the next step is to write out your plan. Google Drive is a good free web tool to do this. As you fill in your plan, colour code your analysis by the key things that you need to remember to consciously include in your plan. These are context, genre, and critical views. You want to have a good amount of each one. Your intro should have a brief mention of genre and context. Your paragraphs should each have either context or genre in them, and your conclusion should recap the main points of context and genre that you've used in your essay. Critics should be dispersed throughout the essay. By using colour coding in your plan, you can really easily see if any of these areas is missing, or if you've got too much of one at the expense of another. Continue your plan until it's completely filled in really good amount of detail. This means with quotes indicated and exactly what you're going to say about each one. With that done, you're ready to start writing. Before I get into writing the intro, main body and conclusion, it's important to know that if you've got lots of interesting ideas and detail in your plan, it's likely that you won't end up having room for it all. That's completely fine. It's better to have some spare points so you can pick the best. And as you're writing, you might realise that some of them don't work as well on paper as they did in theory. Think of it like the writing is the way to try out your plan so that anything that doesn't quite work can be replaced or improved. Let's go over in more detail how each section should look as you write. It is often best to write your introduction last, so although I'll be discussing it first, you should probably do the other two parts first. On a practical level, your introduction must signpost the direction of your essay. The first essential element of this is to name both texts and your authors, making the topic of your essay really clear. You should then signpost the layout of your argument. For instance, if you are doing a section on how both texts present love as essentially tragic at the start of the text, a middle section contrasting how one text then satirises this while the other does not, and a final section contrasting their endings, then your intro should briefly touch on these points. It doesn't have to be a mechanical list, but it should feel as if you have given a sense of the direction of your argument for both texts. You should disperse in here the main bits of context and genre you will be discussing. Finish with a statement that gives your thesis, which should basically outline what your final answer to the question is. It's also important that if there are any clarifications that need to be made that couldn't be made in the question itself, they are made in the introduction. For example, defining a key concept in your question that has multiple definitions, or stating which poems from a collection you will be exploring. There isn't a whole lot for me to say about the main body of your essay. It's really just using all the skills that you've learnt in the rest of your A-level to create clear, interesting analysis. As with your exam essays, you should reuse the words from the question in your opening and closing sentences, and remember not to neglect the quotation in your question if you have one. Do not sacrifice clarity in order to make your essay sound fancy when writing. If a fancy word enhances your meaning, then by all means use it as long as you understand it correctly. But if a simple word will communicate your point just as well, then just use that. The conclusion, which again should be done after the main body, is pretty simple. Basically, just recap what you have argued. The only special touch is that it's nice to make your final sentence well worded. This doesn't mean convoluted or overcomplicated, just expressive and interesting. For example, my final sentence was, for Ellison, identity must be accomplished through the ultimate antisocial action, complete withdrawal from society. This basically just recaps my main point about this text, using the terms from the question. But the final phrase, complete withdrawal from society, has a starkness about it that makes it a bit more dramatic. Basically, just make sure your last sentence is a good one to end on. The hardest stage in the final parts of your essay is cutting words. It is not at all uncommon for the first draft to be way over the word count. My first draft was over by about 700 words. You often have to be ruthless with your cutting and just keep the things that are most tightly relevant to your argument, making sure not to cut any content that enables you to gain context, genre in all the right places. One tip is to take 1 or 2 words from every sentence. That should already result in 5 to 10% less words. Other than that, you just have to painstakingly go through it, unfortunately, as there really isn't any other way or particular trick to make it easier. Lastly, you need to spell check your essay multiple times, since any errors make a poor impression, especially major errors like the title of your text being wrong or the name of their authors being wrong. You also need to write up your bibliography and footnotes, but I'm not going to provide a guide on how to do that here because 1, there are loads already on the internet, and 2, it's quite complicated and your teachers should teach you how to do it anyway. If for some reason they don't, or you're taking the A-Level as a private candidate, then you can just use the internet really. Major errors such as the failure to cite a key text that you've used can have a negative impact, so make sure to double or triple check your bibliography at the end and use a reliable website. Wow, we're finished at last. There are a lot of steps to completing your coursework, but hopefully you've seen from this video that giving your own genuine perspective on the text is a really important aspect of the essay. Although you have to do this within certain boundaries set by AQA, the task is ultimately about expressing your own individual, independently formed views. Good luck with your essays. If you work hard and are organised, I know you'll do brilliantly. Thank you for watching this video, and please subscribe to my channel if you found it helpful.